When you think of religious pilgrimage, the Holy Land comes to mind, as does Rome or even the Catholic shrines of Quebec. But there's another pilgrimage destination where ancient ruins emerge from a dramatic landscape. Ruins that testify to a Christian tradition over 1,500 years old. It's a patrimony that was celebrated at the 50th International Eucharistic Congress. This destination is Ireland. Today on Catholic Focus, we're going to take you on a pilgrimage, and I'll speak with experts about the rich spirituality of this Celtic nation. But first, let's head to the hills of Glendalough. When we speak of the saints of Ireland, the first that comes to mind is the great missionary, St. Patrick. But here in Glendalough, these ruins are a testament to one of Ireland's great monastics, St. Kevin.
St. Kevin basically founded Glendalough, so he would have come here kind of looking for a life of solitude. But he was a very scholarly character, I suppose, and people started coming on pilgrimage, and it really very quickly developed into a place of learning. So that's how Glendalough really started off, and it's expanded and expanded over the centuries to what we pretty much see today, which is a number of different churches and lots of different points of interest dotted around the whole area. And then this here is the priest's house, which is a shrine to St. Kevin's tomb, I suppose. So it would have housed a lot of artefacts that would have had connections with St. Kevin, from his clothing to his bones. It's a beautiful tall high cross that we have in Glendalough. And the tradition is that if you approach the cross, wrap your hands around and try to touch your fingers, it'll grant you one wish. And if you're single, it means you'll be married in a year.
Joining me now in studio is Dr. Anne Dooley, Professor Emerita of Celtic Studies at the University of St. Michael's College, and Father John Reddy, a chaplain at St. Michael's College School in Toronto. And people go often on pilgrimage to Rome or to the Holy Land. What would lead someone to go on a pilgrimage to Ireland?
Well, pilgrimage in Ireland is a matter of internal pilgrimage, I suppose, in the sense that the Irish people themselves love to go to their traditional sites of pilgrimage. And the great one, of course, is the pilgrimage on the last Sunday of July to the holy mountain of St. Patrick, Croagh-Patrick in Mayo. Now, thousands of people make that pilgrimage, which is a fairly arduous thing, climbing a quite steep mountain in the dark in order to hear Mass at dawn on the top of the mountain. A lot of Irish places of pilgrimage are actually places that would have had major assemblies of people for religious purposes.
So they built upon these pagan traditions. Father John, just how old is the Christian tradition in Ireland?
I think many people think it started with Patrick when he arrived in 432, but there were Christians in Ireland long before Patrick got there. So scholars are debating and discussing how early it was, how early the Christian faith came to the country. Did it come with Roman traders? Did people, for some reason, leave the continent and come to the wilds of Ireland to live an ascetic life? But certainly there were Christians there before Patrick arrived.
When we think about the spirituality of Ireland, we always talk about Celtic spirituality. What does that mean? What would you say, Father?
I think, for me, Celtic spirituality is a spirituality that goes back, as Anne was saying, before Christianity. That there was a rich spiritual tradition amongst the people. When Christianity came, it caught their imagination. That Ireland is one of the places where there are no martyrs for the faith in the early years of the church. Because when Christianity came, the people found it an appealing religion and embraced it with great enthusiasm. So it built upon what was already there. I think Celtic Christianity has a very profound sense of the immanence of God, of the presence of God right here with us, and the presence of the saints. I mean, there's some of the old Celtic prayers that would be talking about a woman churning butter, and she'd be churning away, and she'd look across the room and be talking to St. Bridget, or talking to St. Peter, or talking to the Blessed Virgin. So they talked to the saints as real people present with them in the everyday life, the everyday activities of life. And that's a tremendously important aspect of Celtic Christianity.
Well, earlier we learned about Glendalough, and the saint that's associated with Glendalough is Saint Kevin. I understand that he attracted thousands of people from around Europe and was a very vibrant place. Tell us more about Glendalough.
Glendalough, of course, now scenically and architecturally, even in ruins, is one of the most beautiful places in Ireland to visit. Kevin was a saint who wanted solitude. One of the very attractive things about Kevin and the stories about Kevin is something that also attends to other Irish saints, that their relationship to nature is absolutely profound. And there's a wonderful story about Kevin, that St. Kevin was praying and he had his hands out in what the early Irish called a cross vigil. And lo and behold, a blackbird came and started building its nest in his hand. And Kevin did not want to disturb the blackbird, so he stayed in his cross vigil till the eggs were laid, the eggs were hatched, the young blackbirds had flown away because he didn't want to disturb the natural world. So I think one of the really attractive things, as John says, about medieval Christian spirituality is its profound sense of peace and its rapprochement with the elements. One is at peace with the world.
Well, we have lots more to talk about, but first let's go to Kilkenny. My colleague Sebastian Gomes visits St. Canice Cathedral, and I take a trip to Jerpoint Abbey.
The history of Christianity in Ireland dates back to the early 5th century. It has been a time of peace and prosperity, as well as war and division. One of the places that has witnessed it all has been the county of Kilkenny, in which stands the Cathedral of St. Canice.
There has been 800 years of worship in this cathedral. The building commenced in 1202 and it was completed in 1285, so it took them 83 years. The round tower behind me is built on top of 6th century graves. So this is a very, very, very old site, 6th century site. It kind of yo-yoed between religions for a while. And then it settled after Cromwell's visit in 1650, it settled into just being Church of Ireland, Anglican, Episcopalian. But it was initially Roman Catholic.
The tower at St. Canice was built sometime between the year 700 and 1100. It's the oldest surviving structure in Kilkenny. It's one of only 2 historic towers in all of Ireland that visitors can safely climb.
It was built for defence. That was the main idea. Now there's lots of theories to what round towers were for, but it was mainly built for defence. It also would have had a bell right at the top of it, so it was also a status symbol. But you can see that the 6 windows that wrap around the top of it there would have been the defensive windows, a lookout from the top. And you can see that they're just narrow little slits. So the whole idea is that if you were down here and you were trying to attack, you'd find it very difficult to get anything up in through those. But if you were on the other side and looking out, you'd have a great vantage point pretty much. It's 100 feet high and it has 2 foot of a foundation, which does not sound like a huge amount, considering the amount that's up in the sky, but it's holding itself up, which is just an amazing feat. But because it's circular, it distributes the weight evenly onto each stone. So there's not one stone under more pressure than the next. So it's able to stand there perfectly, and it has done for the last 1200 years.
The Irish Church is experiencing a painful trial as it seeks to rebuild trust after the abuse crisis. But it has survived adversity before and been reborn anew. The ruins at Jerpoint Abbey recall perhaps its greatest crisis.
Well, Jerpoint Abbey was one of a number of different abbeys and kind of groups that would have come to Europe when the Normans very much came over, basically in the 1100s. So it was like the new way of teaching religion, and that's how these abbeys were formed. A lot of the old monasteries started to, let's say, lose vocations as these new ways were seen as the kind of more modern way of teaching religion in Ireland. Yeah, unfortunately, in the 1500s with King Henry VIII and the Reformation, a lot of these old monasteries basically were given a choice, I suppose. You could be destroyed or change religion. And unfortunately, Jerpoint Abbey fell to the first choice, which it was destroyed. The windows would have been knocked out, the roof taken down or burnt out and things like that. So basically it was uninhabitable again. Whereas some other churches would have changed religion, become Anglican Church of Ireland, and those are still in existence today. In essence, in adversity, sometimes you do have an underground swell of belief. It was very difficult to change their ways. So there was penal laws introduced in Ireland to suppress the Catholic religion, but that only made it stronger. And throughout the 1600s and 1700s, there was a huge underswell. And in the 1800s, when Catholic emancipation came about, they were allowed to build the churches again and things like that. So a lot of the Catholic churches will be a bit more modern than the Anglican ones.
I'm back with Dr. Anne Dooley and Father John Reddy. When we visited these sites in Ireland, Glendalough, Jerpoint Abbey, St. Canice Cathedral, it seemed like we were seeing mostly tourists. When did the pilgrims come in?
Traditional sort of Irish monastic sites would have had what we call a pattern day. That is the feast of the patron. And it's quite interesting that many of them are clustered around the last Sunday in July, which just shows how very, very old and possibly even pre-Christian some of these assemblies are. You won't see pilgrims every day of the week there, but you will see huge assemblies that are very, very important for local people. Now, you won't see it at Jerpoint, because Jerpoint is one of the Cistercian houses that belongs to the Anglo-Norman occupation phase of that part of Ireland. And these houses were very richly endowed by the Anglo-Normans. But if you wanted to see close to Jerpoint, a site of great significance to the local people, you would go down the river, so to speak, to the sister river of the Nore, which flows through Kilkenny and so on, the Barrow, to St. Mullins's on the Carlow-Wexford-Kilkenny border. And there you'll see one of the great local pattern days, so to speak.
And that's one that's important for your family, is that
that's
right?
What, well, by the link, you might say. My sister-in-law, her people are buried there. And for her, that's the most important day. Christmas, you can take it or leave it. But by God, pattern day in St. Mullins's is the place to be. Yes, yes. And, you know, there have been family weddings where my sister-in-law, Mags, will not come to the wedding because it is... pattern day at St. Mullins's. Now, that's kind of interesting because there are other traditions with that place, traditions that have to do with that whole area. And that is in 1798, there was a great local rural uprising there against the English, we'll say, by way of shorthand. So in this sense, you can see how, sure, there are holy aspects to pilgrimage, but like every great pilgrimage anywhere, it's carnival time as well. It's a common culture memory spot where a lot of things are reenacted. Social solidarity around agreed norms, like Christianity, like nationalism, and like that, in a sense, rebellion, which is remembered with so many songs and so on, and was a very important memory marker for Ireland as it moved into a stage of fighting for its own independence at the beginning of the 20th century.
Well, certainly a lot of these sites have been affected by the national history of Ireland. I mean, you see St. Canice, now an Anglican site, Jerpoint Abbey in ruins. Is it still in some ways contentious that some of these sites that were formerly Catholic are no longer being used by the Catholics, being used by the Anglican minorities?
Now, for myself, growing up in the shadow of Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin, it creates some interesting situations because Dublin City has two cathedrals dating back to the 12th century, and both of them belong to the Church of Ireland. So the Catholic Church in the Archdiocese of Dublin doesn't have a cathedral. They have a co-cathedral as they wait, I think hopefully, for perhaps one of the old cathedrals to be handed over. And there was talk just within the past few years of Christ Church Cathedral being handed over to the Catholic Church. And it received some considerable debate and discussion.
Well, you're
it
right,
didn't
John.
happen. But it's an interesting situation that in the capital city there are two cathedrals, but no Catholic cathedral.
Well, I want to talk to you both more about St. Patrick, but before we do, let's take a visit to one of those cathedrals, St. Patrick's namesake cathedral in Dublin. There were never any snakes in Ireland. You've all heard the legend that St. Patrick drove them out of this country. But it's a tradition that obscures what St. Patrick brought to Ireland, namely the Christian faith to a pagan people. And for many of them, that faith began right here, above an old well where St. Patrick baptized some of Ireland's first Christians. And it's a site now commemorated by Dublin's renowned St. Patrick's Cathedral.
He's probably from Wales or south of England, not originally Irish, and would have been captured and brought to Ireland initially by pirates. So he was actually a slave in Ireland for a long time before escaping and heading back to either England or the north of France, at which point then he educated himself and was educated in Christianity. And it was then having had a message from God in a dream that he decided to come back to Ireland to bring Christianity to the pagan people here. There was a stone slab which was found marking the point of the well or the spring where St. Patrick was originally believed to be baptizing people. But the importance of the site was remembered and marked by people in the area working before here.
A dean of the cathedral was one of the country's most beloved authors. Jonathan Swift wrote the novel Gulliver's Travels and the satirical essay A Modest Proposal. While he's remembered for his writing, his preaching was also legendary.
There's a number of different objects around the cathedral. In particular, his pulpit is best known, which is at one point mounted on wheels. And it's believed that he'd have himself wheeled around the cathedral as he was preaching. His sermons could last anything up to an hour. He had a lot of problems with people sleeping or paying very little attention to him when he was preaching. So by having his pulpit on wheels, he could address those people without interrupting his sermon.
I'm back with Dr. Anne Dooley and Father John Reddy. Being from the 4th century, the historicity of the stories around St. Patrick is often questioned. Is it important for the Irish whether or not these stories are true, Anne?
St. Patrick is someone that we know an awful lot about because we have the record of his own, if you like, written witness to his own life and his own ministry. And that is a rare, of course, and extraordinary document for the Church in the West. It's an authentic document.
This is the Confession of St. Patrick?
The Confession of St. Patrick, yes. It's a confession of faith. There are certain things in that confession that shows us his care for women and for young people, particularly in the matter of young people wishing to remove themselves from the militarism of a warrior society and desiring to live an alternative life in peace. In other words, we see a kind of proto-monasticism and a very strong going with that biblical spirituality. And I think there was a consciousness in the Irish Church all through the Middle Ages that Patrick not only left an organizational legacy, but a spiritual legacy as well.
My last question for you, Father John. There's the pilgrimage to Lough Derg, also known as St. Patrick's Purgatory, and even the website for this pilgrimage says it's the toughest pilgrimage in Europe, if not the whole Christian world. What does this say about the spirituality of the Irish?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting today is that an increasing number of young people are making the pilgrimage to Croagh Patrick and making the pilgrimage to Lough Derg.
Have either of you done either of those two pilgrimages?
I've done Croagh Patrick, but to my shame,
Not
I've
Lough
never
Derg.
done Lough Derg. It's
Yeah.
too hard.
I don't know if I'd have the stamina. Yeah. It's very penitential, you know, and it's very demanding. But I know people who go year after year after year and wouldn't miss it. You know, this is an essential part of their faith life and an essential part of their identity as Irish Catholic. But the people I know who have made the pilgrimage to Lough Derg generally go out of a spirit of thanksgiving, that they often make the pilgrimage as a gesture to God that they're grateful for something. And so they'll deny themselves and they'll go through this rather rigorous penitential ordeal. But the ultimate expression that they're trying to communicate is gratitude to God.
Well, we're all out of time, but thanks so much for joining us and sharing your insights, Dr. Anne Dooley and Father John Reddy. Our pilgrimage is coming to an end, but before we go, Sebastian takes us to some enduring artistic treasures, the high crosses at Moon.
By the middle of the 9th century, Viking ships had landed on the coasts and on the riverbanks of Ireland. Many of them moved inland, pillaging the towns and the monasteries that they came across. But what they didn't take, and what has endured for over 1,000 years, are the Irish high crosses, a testament to the vibrancy of an early medieval Christian culture.
Here we are at Moon High Cross. Moon High Cross is a great example of the high crosses of Ireland. It's the second tallest high cross we have in the country and probably one of the best preserved, because over the centuries the cross itself had collapsed into the ground and fallen with the building, and it was only discovered about 150 years ago under a lot of rubble. So fortunately it meant that the cross itself didn't get weathered over the centuries, so it's a great example of carvings that we have. The cross here itself is it's almost like a picture book of scenes from and stories from the Bible. So what you have is different stories and scenes like Adam and Eve and the forbidden fruit and the flight from Egypt and the 12 apostles and fish and loaves of bread, things like that. So it was very easy for people to follow, I suppose, and understand the story of the Bible, because not everybody was literate back then, so they couldn't understand or read for themselves, you know. So the crosses generally would have 3 parts to the cross. So you'd have the base, the centre and the capstone. The cross here was actually originally, when they only found 2 parts of it, they had it constructed with the bottom and the top, and it was only in more recent times that they found the centrepiece and inserted it in, which makes it over 7 metres tall, the second tallest one in Ireland. Also, the pagan people were sun worshippers originally, because they were very into their farming, and the sun brought about the seasons, so they believed in the sun god. And it was a very easy transition for them to move over into Christianity when in Ireland we implemented the circle on the cross, which basically is now what we call the Celtic cross. But it was easy for them to worship the cross because the sun symbol was in the cross as well.
That's all the time we have on Catholic Focus. If you've been on pilgrimage to Ireland, share your experience on our Facebook page or send us an email at focus@saltandlighttv.org. For Catholic Focus, I'm Kris Dmytrenko. Thanks for watching.